Turning Points in the Fight for Freedom by Pat McCarthy. The American Revolution did not begin as a war for independence. The American colonists wanted to be treated as British citizens with the same rights that people in Britain had. When Parliament, Britain's lawmaking body, began taxing the colonies directly, the colonists rebelled. The colonists felt that it was unfair for Parliament to tax them when the colonists could not vote for members of Parliament. Taxation without representation is tyranny, became their cry. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required colonists to buy stamps and place them on important papers, including letters, deeds, newspapers, and even playing cards. Many colonists refused to buy the stamps. Parliament believed the taxes were fair because it had sent British soldiers to protect the colonists during the French and Indian War, and believed that the colonists should pay for the war's costs. Parliament also passed more acts that taxed the colonists. The Boston Tea Party. Parliament finally canceled all the taxes except the tax on tea. The colonists still were not happy. In 1773, Britain sent 3 ships full of tea to Boston Harbor, but the Bostonians would not allow it to be unloaded. When Britain refused to take the tea back, a number of patriots dressed as Mohawks boarded the ships. They threw 342 chests of tea overboard in what became known as the Boston Tea Party. No one knows who participated, but many were probably members of the Sons of Liberty, a group of patriot activists. Britain closed the port of Boston to punish the patriots. The Battles of Lexington and Concord. On the night of April 18, 1775, 800 British troops marched from Boston to the village of Lexington. When the troops reached Lexington, they found about 50 militiamen. They called themselves Minutemen because they were ready to fight at a minute's notice. The British were on their way to Concord to seize the colonists' ammunition stored there. The night before, 3 men on horseback had tried to alert the people of both towns that the British were coming. In Lexington, Major John Pitcairn, second in command of the British soldiers, yelled, "Disperse! Move away, ye rebels, disperse!" A moment later, a shot rang out. Nobody knows which side it came from, but the British returned fire without waiting for orders. 8 Minutemen were killed, and 10 others were wounded. The British troops then went on to Concord, where they removed the ammunition in the arsenal. They then searched nearby houses and farms for the rest of the hidden ammunition, but it had been taken to other towns. At the Old North Bridge near Concord, another battle took place between the British and the Americans. In the 2 battles, 49 Americans were killed, and 39 were wounded. About 73 British were killed, and 174 were wounded. The British then returned to Boston. When the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia heard of the battles, it elected George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the new army. The Battle of Bunker Hill. The next major battle was the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was fought on nearby Breed's Hill. British ships were in Boston Harbor, and the Americans heard the British were planning an attack. During the night of June 16, 1775, the Americans took ammunition and guns to the top of Breed's Hill. They built a redoubt, a kind of temporary fort made by piling up dirt. It measured 160 feet long. When the British awoke the next morning, they were amazed to see the redoubt and began firing from the ships. The fort was out of range. 2,000 British troops started up Breed's Hill. Each soldier carried a 60-pound pack and found it hard to move through the tall grass and climb over stone walls. Because they were low on ammunition, the Americans held their fire until the British were close. Supposedly, Colonel William Prescott ordered his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Finally, shots rang out, and dozens of British soldiers fell. Twice the troops were forced to retreat, but on the 3rd try, the British were able to take the hill. The Americans had run out of ammunition, but they continued to fight with bayonets. The first American officer to lose his life in the war was Dr. Joseph Warren, a great patriot and leader. He was an officer, but he chose to fight with his troops. It was a British victory, but the Americans had proved they could hold their own in battle. More than 1,000 British were killed or wounded, while the Americans lost about 145 men. British General George Clinton said it was a dear-bought, costly victory. Another such would have ruined us. During the next year and a half, several battles were fought. The Americans established a continental navy and looked for help from other countries. France began giving aid to the colonies. The Continental Congress wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence, declaring that the 13 colonies were a free country. The British took over New York City in the summer of 1776, and Washington's troops were forced to evacuate. The British won several victories in a row, and Washington's troops retreated across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in December 1776. The Battle of Trenton. On Christmas Day, the British Army was camped in Trenton, New Jersey. The army was made up mostly of Hessians, German soldiers paid to fight for the British. Washington knew they would celebrate Christmas late into the night, with dancing and singing, so he decided the next morning would be the perfect time for a surprise attack. During the night, 2,400 American soldiers crossed the river. Their boats dodged large chunks of floating ice, and wind and sleet made their journey miserable. The British Army was taken completely by surprise. Washington's army did not suffer a single loss of life, and only 4 of his men were wounded. About 22 British soldiers were killed, and 92 were wounded. The Americans captured the remaining men. One of Washington's officers wrote in his diary, "We have taken nearly 1,000 prisoners, 6 cannon, more than 1,000 muskets, 12 drums." The Battle of Trenton provided badly needed supplies and ammunition and boosted the soldiers' morale. A few days later, the Americans defeated the British at Princeton. In July 1777, the British captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Marquis de Lafayette, a Frenchman, volunteered and became Washington's trusted aide. That summer, the British defeated the Americans in Brandywine Creek in Pennsylvania, and British forces occupied Philadelphia in September. The Battle of Saratoga. British General John Burgoyne planned to send 3 armies into New York State. The armies would meet in Albany, and New England would then be separated from the rest of the colonies. At first, the plan seemed to work. The Americans held the British off during the First Battle of Saratoga on September 19, 1777. General Burgoyne was forced to retreat, halting the British advance into New York. 3 weeks later, the Americans beat the British at Bemis Heights in the Second Battle of Saratoga. This was an important victory. Major General Horatio Gates and Major General Benedict Arnold led the American army. The 2 sides negotiated, and on October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of 5,000 men. This was the turning point of the war, when things began to change. The world now believed the Americans could win the war, and European countries gave their support to the Americans. In the winter of 1777, Washington's army set up quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The army's morale was low for 3 months because of cold, hunger, disease, and lack of supplies. In June 1778, Washington's army fought General Henry Clinton's troops to a standoff in the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. In July, France declared war on Britain, and the British could not concentrate all their resources on fighting the Americans. In December 1778, the British began a campaign in the South, capturing Savannah and Augusta, Georgia. In 1779, the British asked American Indians to attack frontier settlements. That September, John Paul Jones, who commanded the ship Bonhomme Richard, fought a battle with the British ship Serapis off the coast of England. The British called for Jones's surrender, but he replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." Jones managed to capture the British ship as his ship sank. The next spring, the British captured Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina. This was the worst American defeat in the war, and the Americans lost their entire Southern Army of 5,400 men, along with 4 ships. British troops, led by General Charles Cornwallis, defeated the Americans in battles in South Carolina. Cornwallis planned to invade North Carolina, but he changed his plans after the Americans won the Battle of Kings Mountain. General Nathanael Greene was named commander of the Southern Army. Greene's army spent the next 6 months chasing Cornwallis through the backwoods of the Carolinas and Virginia. The British were short on supplies. In March 1781, Cornwallis suffered heavy losses in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. He retreated into Virginia and made Yorktown his base. The Battle of Yorktown. In a brilliant move, Washington decided to attack the British on the Yorktown Peninsula. French Admiral de Grasse headed for Chesapeake Bay near Yorktown. His fleet included 29 ships and 3,000 soldiers. De Grasse's fleet fought a major battle with the British fleet. The defeated British fleet retreated to New York, and de Grasse kept Cornwallis from leaving the peninsula by sea. More French ships arrived, and de Grasse sent some of them up Chesapeake Bay to transport Washington's army to Yorktown. Here the American troops, with 17,000 men, began a siege of Yorktown. British supplies were running low, and the French fleet fired cannons at the British day and night. The American army surrounded them, making it impossible for the British to retreat by land. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his troops at Yorktown. This was the last major battle of the war. Parliament voted in February not to continue the war. The next month, peace negotiations began. The untrained, poorly outfitted group of patriots had defeated the highly trained and well-supplied British Army and Navy. The United States of America was free at last.